Section 2. This is Chapter 18, Section 2, Roosevelt in Office. Main idea. With Theodore Roosevelt's succession to the presidency in September 1901, progressivism entered national politics. Key terms and names: the Square Deal, Northern Securities, United Mine Workers, Arbitration, Hepburn Act, Upton Sinclair. American story. When William McKinley's assassination brought Teddy Roosevelt to the presidency, despite the tragic circumstances, he took to the office with great joy. A man who loved the outdoors and physical activity, Roosevelt impressed many people as a new kind of president. One visitor wrote after spending time with Roosevelt, "You go home and wring the personality out of your clothes." The famous muckraker, Lincoln Steffens, already knew Roosevelt as a fellow reformer. Steffens went to Washington to see his friend, and this is what he saw. His offices were crowded with people, mostly reformers, all day long. He strode triumphant around among us, talking and shaking hands, dictating and signing letters, and laughing. Washington, the whole country, was in mourning, and no doubt the president felt he should hold himself down. He didn't. He tried to, but his joy showed in every word and every movement. With his feet, his fists, his face, and his free words, he laughed at his luck. He laughed with glee at the power and place that had come to him. Roosevelt revives the presidency. Theodore Roosevelt, better known as Teddy, took office at age 42, the youngest person ever to serve as president. Roosevelt was intensely competitive, strong-willed, and extremely energetic. In international affairs, Roosevelt was a social Darwinist. He believed the United States was in competition with the other nations of the world, and that only the fittest would survive. Domestically, however, Roosevelt was a committed progressive who firmly believed that government should actively balance the needs of competing groups in American society. "I shall see to it," Roosevelt declared in 1904, "that every man has a square deal, no less and no more." During his second term, his reform programs became known as the Square Deal. Key term. The Square Deal. To Roosevelt, it was not inconsistent to believe in social Darwinism and progressivism at the same time. He believed the United States needed to adopt progressive reforms in order to maintain an efficient society that could compete successfully against other nations. Roosevelt takes on the trusts. Although he admired competition, Roosevelt was also concerned with efficiency. He believed that trusts and other large business organizations were very efficient and part of the reason for America's prosperity. Yet Roosevelt remained concerned that in the pursuit of their private interests, some trusts were hurting the public interest. He wanted to find a way to supervise big business without destroying its economic efficiency. When the New York Sun declared that Roosevelt was bringing wealth to its knees, the president disagreed. "We draw the line against misconduct," he declared, "not against wealth." During Roosevelt's first year in office, a fight for the control of the Burlington Railroad erupted on the New York Stock Exchange. One side was E.H. Harriman of the Union Pacific Railroad. On the other side was James J. Hill and J.P. Morgan of the Great Northern and Northern Pacific Railroads. The stock battle almost triggered a financial panic that could have plunged the nation into a recession. The three men ultimately compromised by creating a giant new holding company called Northern Securities. Key term: Northern Securities. The formation of the Northern Securities Companies alarmed many Americans, including Roosevelt. The stock battle that led to its creation seemed a classic example of private interests acting in a way that threatened the nation as a whole. Roosevelt decided that the company was in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. In early 1902, he ordered his Attorney General to file a lawsuit against Northern Securities. Roosevelt's action pleased many progressives, but baffled J.P. Morgan. He immediately traveled to the White House with 2 supportive senators in tow to present his case. He said, "If we've done anything wrong," he told the president, "send your man to my man and they can fix it up." Unmoved, Roosevelt proceeded with the case. In 1904, the Northern Securities versus the United States, the Supreme Court ruled that Northern Securities had indeed violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. Roosevelt declared it a great victory. The most powerful men in the country, he proclaimed, were held to accountability before the law. Newspapers hailed Roosevelt as a trust buster, and his popularity with the American public soared. Coal strike in 1902. As president, Roosevelt regarded himself as the nation's head manager. He believed it was his job to keep society operating efficiently by preventing conflict between the nation's different groups and their interests. In the fall of 1902, he put these beliefs into practice. The previous spring, the United Mine Workers, key term, the United Mine Workers, or the UMW union, had called a strike of the miners who dug anthracite, or hard coal. Nearly 150,000 workers walked out of eastern Pennsylvania's anthracite mines, demanding a pay increase, a reduction in work hours, and recognition for their union. As the months passed and the strike continued, coal prices began to rise. To Roosevelt, it was another example of groups pursuing their private interests at the expense of the nation. If the strike dragged on too long, the country would face a coal shortage that could shut down factories and leave many people's homes cold with winter fast approaching. Roosevelt urged the union and the owners to accept arbitration. Key term. Arbitration, a settlement imposed by an outside party. The union agreed. The mine owners, determined to destroy the UMW, did not. One owner, George Bears, declared, "The rights and interests of the laboring man will be protected and cared for not by the labor agitators, but by the Christian men to whom God, in His infinite wisdom, has given the control of the property interests of the country." The mine owners' stubbornness infuriated Roosevelt, as it did much of the public. Roosevelt threatened to order the army to run the mines. Fearful of this, the mine owners eventually accepted arbitration. By intervening in the dispute, Roosevelt had taken the first step towards establishing the federal government as an honest broker between powerful groups in society. Bureau of Corporations. Despite his lawsuit against Northern Securities and his role in the coal strike, Roosevelt was not opposed to big business. He believed that most trusts benefited the economy and breaking them up would do more harm than good. Instead, Roosevelt proposed the creation of a new federal agency to investigate corporations and publicize the results. He believed the most effective way to keep big business from abusing its power was through knowledge and publicity of the facts. In 1903, Roosevelt convinced Congress to create the Department of Commerce and Labor. Within this department would be a division called the Bureau of Corporations. Key term. Bureau of Corporations, with authority to investigate corporations and issue reports on their activities. Following year, Bureau of Corporations began investigating U.S. Steel, a gigantic holding company that had been created in 1901. Worried about a possible antitrust lawsuit, the company's leaders met privately with Roosevelt and offered a deal. They would open their account books and records to the Bureau of Corporations. In exchange, if the Bureau found anything wrong, the company would be advised privately and allowed to correct the problem without having to go to court. Roosevelt accepted this gentleman's agreement, as he called it. Shortly afterward, he made similar deals with other companies. These arrangements gave Roosevelt the ability to regulate big business without having to sacrifice economic efficiency by breaking up the trusts. Congress follows. In addition to creating the Department of Commerce and Labor, Congress passed the Expedition Act, which gave federal antitrust suits precedence on the dockets of circuit courts. Then, in 1906, Roosevelt pushed the Hepburn Act. Key name, key term. Roosevelt pushed the Hepburn Act through Congress. This act was intended to strengthen the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC. In an early effort to regulate the railroad industry, the ICC had been ineffective because it lacked sufficient authority. But the Hepburn Act tried to strengthen the ICC by giving it the power to set railroad rates. The agency originally was intended to regulate rates to ensure that companies did not compete unfairly. At first, railroad companies were suspicious of the ICC and tied up its decisions by challenging them in court. Eventually, the railroads realized that if they could work with the ICC to set rates and regulations that limited competition and prevented new competitors from entering the industry. Over time, the ICC had become a supporter of the railroad's interest, and by 1920 it had begun setting rates at levels intended to ensure the industry's profits. Social welfare action. When Roosevelt took office, he was not greatly concerned about consumer issues, but by 1905, consumer protection had become a national issue. That year, a journalist named Samuel Hopkins Adams published a series of articles in Collier's magazine describing the patent medicine business. Many companies were patenting and marketing potions they claimed would cure a variety of ills. Many patent medicines were little more than alcohol, colored water, and sugar. Others contained caffeine, opium, cocaine, and other dangerous compounds. Consumers had no way to know what they were taking, nor did they receive any assurance that the medicines worked as claimed. Many Americans were equally concerned about the food they ate. Dr. W. H. Wiley, chief chemist at the United States Department of Agriculture, had issued reports documenting the dangerous preservatives being used in what he called embalmed meat. Then, in 1906, Upton Sinclair, key name, key term, Upton Sinclair, published The Jungle, based on Sinclair's close observations of the slaughterhouses of Chicago. The powerful book featured appalling descriptions of conditions in the meatpacking industry. There would come all the way back from Europe old sausage that had been rejected, and it was moldy and white. It would be dosed with borax and glycerin and dumped into the hoppers and made over again for home consumption. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race upon it. Sinclair's book was a bestseller. It made consumers ill and angry. Roosevelt and Congress responded with the Meat Inspection Act. That's key name, key term. The Meat Inspection Act. It required federal inspection of meat sold through interstate commerce and required the Agriculture Department to set standards of cleanliness in meatpacking plants. The Pure Food and Drug Act, key name, key term. Pure Food and Drug Act, passed on the same day in 1906, prohibited the manufacture, sale, or shipment of impure or falsely labeled food and drugs. Conservation. Roosevelt put his stamp on the presidency most clearly in the area of environmental conservation. Realizing that the nation's bountiful natural resources were being used up at an alarming rate, Roosevelt urged Americans to conserve these resources. An enthusiastic outdoorsman, Roosevelt valued the country's minerals, animals, and rugged terrain. He cautioned against unregulated exploitation of public lands and believed in conservation to manage the nation's resources. As president, Roosevelt eagerly assumed the role of manager. He argued the government must distinguish between the man who skins the land and the man who develops the country. I'm going to work with, and only with, the man who develops the country. Here's a little factoid here. The teddy bear. The soft and cuddly teddy bear was named after the gruff and rugged Theodore Teddy Roosevelt. The idea for the toy stemmed from a hunting trip Roosevelt took to Mississippi in 1902. On the trip, the president refused to kill a defenseless bear cub. Cartoonist Clifford Berryman drew a whimsical reenactment of the scene for the Washington Post, which in turn inspired Morris Witchem, a toy shop owner in Brooklyn, to create the teddy bear. The toy became a runaway success in the United States and abroad. Geography, land development in the West. Roosevelt quickly applied his philosophy in the dry western states, where farmers and city dwellers competed for scarce water. In 1902, Roosevelt supported passage of the Newlands Reclamation Act. Key name, key term. The Newlands Reclamation Act, authorizing the use of federal funds from public land sales to pay for irrigation and land development projects. Thus, it was the federal government that began the large-scale transformation of the West's landscape and economy. Gifford Pinchot. Roosevelt also backed efforts to save the nation's forests through careful management of the timber resources of the West. He appointed his close friend, Gifford Pinchot, to head the United States Forest Service. The natural resources, Pinchot said, must be developed and preserved for the benefit of the many, and not merely for the profit of a few. As progressives, Roosevelt and Pinchot both believed that trained experts in forestry and resource management should apply the same scientific standards to the landscape that others were applying to the management of cities and industry. They rejected the laissez-faire argument that the best way to preserve public land was to sell it to lumber companies who would then carefully conserve it because it was the source of their profits. With the president's support, Pinchot's department drew up regulations controlling lumbering on federal lands. Roosevelt took other steps as well to conserve the nation's resources. He added over 100 million acres to the protected national forests, quadrupling their area, and established 5 new national parks and 51 federal wildlife reservations. Roosevelt's legacy. Roosevelt changed the role of the federal government and the nature of the presidency. Increasingly, Americans began to look to the federal government to solve the nation's economic and social problems. Under Roosevelt, the executive branch of government had dramatically increased its power. The ICC could set rates, the Agriculture Department could inspect food, and the Bureau of Corporations could monitor business, and the Attorney General could rapidly bring antitrust suits under the Expedition Act. All right. Define the square deal and arbitration. And that concludes our reading of Section 2, Chapter 18.